Good evening, everybody. Thank you all for coming here today. We have Rosa Abraham. Rosa Abraham is a faculty at Azim Premji University, where she is a part of the economics group. Her research focused on issues relating to India's labor market, including informal work and women's employment. Her recent research examined the impact of major life events, including marriage and childbirth, on women's employment outcomes and the challenges in capturing women's employment. At the Center for Sustainability Employment, a research center at the university, she's involved in the center's flagship publication, The State of Working India Reports. Thank you so much for coming here today. Over to you.
Hi everyone. Thanks for the invitation to the organizers, and thanks to all of you for making time on a Sunday evening to come and listen to this, what I hope will be an interesting discussion. So I think since there's just so few of us, I'm happy to have conversations in between. So if you want clarifications, just raise your hands and we can I'm happy to take those questions and discussions in between. So my work is largely drawing upon some of the work that we do at the Center for Sustainable Employment. And as she mentioned, we have this report called the State of Working India Report, which is published every 2 years, which looks at sort of the state of the labor market, and we focus on various themes. And the last theme of the report was actually looking at social identities. And so social identities, we looked at caste, gender, and religion to see how these social identities played out in the labor market. And for this talk, I really just wanted to focus at the identity of gender and how that interacts with women's employment. Okay. So just to give you some context on what is going on with women's employment in India, what you have here is what is a very commonly used statistic when we look at the labor market, which is the workforce participation rate, which is the WPR. Essentially, it's also what you would know very familiarly as the employment rate. And what that is of all the working age population, how many of those in the working age population, how many of them are employed? So employment meaning any work for pay or profit. Right? So if I look at this number here, about 28%, it is to say that of women who are 15 years and above in 2020, about 28% were in paid work. Right? So there's two things that you can see here. One is male employment rate. So these two lines are for rural and urban employment for men. And you can see that male employment rate is high. In fact, but if you compare this to other countries, actually India's male employment rate is not very high. It usually tends to get to around 80. We're not as high, but we're thereabouts. It has increased in more recent years. I don't have the more recent data. But one thing you see is women's employment rate is much lower than men. So out of 100 women of working age, only 20 in urban areas are in paid employment. So not just is it very low, in rural areas you can see that it's declined in more recent years, although after COVID you will actually see that it actually has increased, and this has occupied a lot of interest in the literature. I'm happy to talk about what has been driving some of that increase. But the other thing more relevant for us, especially in the urban context, is how urban employment rates for women is very low, and it really has not changed at all. So even with the more recent years, the number is around 20, 25, 21%. So it's the low levels and the declining rates which has occupied a lot of interest in India. I just want to put this in context of where India stands with respect to the rest of the world. Okay? So what I have here is the per capita income. So this is the per capita income, and each of these are countries across the world. Okay? And you will see that India is actually located, it's sort of hidden, it's somewhere here, it's overlaid with a bunch of stuff. So at this level of per capita income, this is where we are in terms of women's employment. Now this is a trend line that you fit, which is to say, given all of this information of what employment rates for women look like across the country, across countries, what do you normally expect? Okay? And this is what is very famous in the literature. It's called the U-shaped relationship, which is that at initial, when countries are poor, a lot of the economy is agricultural, and because of that there's a lot of women's employment. There's also low income, so women have to work, so employment rate tends to be very high. As you move up the income order, countries tend to get richer, women move into education, agriculture contracts, so then women withdraw from employment. And then as countries move into kind of manufacturing and more services and jobs that are more amenable or suitable for women, and as education rates for women go up, you'll find that women's employment tends to increase, right? So that's sort of your prediction, and that yellow line there is saying this is what it should look like, right? And you can see that for India, we're well below that predicted number. For our level of GDP, an interesting comparison is Vietnam here, which has very similar levels of per capita income and extremely high rates of participation of women in the workforce. So that's Vietnam. But India is well below that. And if you see the red ones, these are actually Indian states. So it looks like all states are equally underperforming when it comes to engaging women. There are two exceptions, that's Himachal Pradesh and Meghalaya, where women's employment rate is actually quite high for their level of development. So this has been a bit of an anomaly in a sense when you look at what has been trends in women's employment in India. And if you look at what kinds of employment women are in, so broadly, labor markets are divided into these very broad kinds of employment. One is your regular salaried work. So you get a monthly pay, there's a fairly decent amount of predictability around what you're expected to do and how often you get paid. So that's your regular salaried employment. And then you have casual wage work, which is your daily wage workers who often get paid on a daily wage rate. And then you have self-employment. And self-employment, I mean largely in India, what this is your one man or one woman enterprises. So it's your little vending shop down the road, it's your food carts selling vegetables. Those are, your petty shops, those are your self-employment. They don't hire people, they don't create jobs for others. It's just one person enterprises. And you can see in there's not a huge difference between what men do and what women do. What you can see is that women typically tend to be in self-employment, a much smaller share in casual wage work, and an even smaller share in regular salaried work compared to men. So more men tend to be in regular salaried work compared to women, right? But it's not too far off. Which is to say that very few women are employed. When they are employed, the majority tends to be in self-employment and an equal share in casual wage work and salaried employment. But where the contrast becomes very apparent is if you were to look at this between rural and urban women, right? So within rural and urban areas, what you have is that in rural areas, employment of women largely tends to be self-employment or unpaid family work. So unpaid family work, I don't mean care work or domestic work. This is you're helping in the family farm, you're helping in a business, you're contributing to the creation of something that is sold. It's just that you don't get a salary or you don't get the earnings directly, you get to share in that earnings, right? So rural areas, largely it's this kind of self-employment, which is to be expected given that it is an agricultural economy. Whereas in urban areas, you'll see actually half of women in the urban workforce tends to be in salaried employment, which is great news. And this is, you're talking about your cities as well. I will say that, we actually don't have data on these things at the city or district level. Unfortunately, our labor statistics doesn't allow us to go too deep into it. At best, we can talk about rural and urban and not beyond that. But by urban, largely this is representing a lot of what is happening in our cities and large towns. Now, what is it that when urban women are in salaried employment, if you look at the data, what is it that you're doing? So salaried employment, one big chunk of this employment is your domestic help. It's not something that immediately occurs to you when you think of salaried employment, but for several reasons, labor statistics categorizes this category of workers as salaried because they're getting a regular monthly payment, okay? So it's not your typical understanding of salaried employment. The 53% of urban women who are salaried are actually, a large chunk of them are domestic help. Another big sector of employment in urban areas is education and health. So these are also traditionally just sectors that are known to be, high employers of women. Right? But the other thing that comes into play is when you talk about salaried work, you think that this comes with a regular payment, it comes with contracts, and it comes with a paid a contract, but also social security benefits like your PF and paid leave and so on. What you see is for the women who are in salaried employment, for about half of them, 40% of them, they get contract, they also get some kind of benefits. But for the remaining, they either don't have a contract or they don't have a benefit, or for another big chunk of them, they have neither. Okay, so even though it is salaried employment, a lot of salaried employment that women are engaged in, particularly that what women are engaged in, tends to be what we call informal employment, because it doesn't come with basic social security arrangements. And when it comes to women in self-employment in rural areas, again, education is a big sector. So it's education and tutoring service, so home-based kind of work. Another big employer is your tailoring work, and then your BD. So, staying at home and being able to do these kinds of things is another big kind of self-employment that you think about. So I think the reason I also wanted to put it in there is that when we talk about salaried employment in urban areas, and you think your first kind of thinking is to think of maybe, especially from Bangalore, you're thinking about your IT workers. But actually that is perhaps, if you look at the data, that accounts for less than 1% of women in salaried employment. So it's a really, really niche group of women that you talk about. And when you talk about salaried employment in our cities, this is the kind of work that you're talking about. You're talking about domestic help, you're talking about teachers, and you're talking about doctors and nurses as well. Right? Okay, so that's just sort of giving you some context on what is the state of the labor market, especially in urban areas. Now going back to sort of this motivating question for this talk, which is that why are employment rates so low for women? I don't have the answers. I have some conjectures to it, which draws upon some of the literature. Because when I put out the call, I think the first line in my slide said, why is women's employment so low? And then my colleague called me up and said, yes, tell me the answer, tell me the answer. And I was like, I don't know. But this is a bunch of explanations that's been put forward in the literature. So one is what we call a supply side kind of description, which is to say why women's employment is low is explained by the characteristics of women, characteristics of the society that they come from, characteristics of, of the workers and the challenges that they face. So that's what we characterize as supply side. And what I've listed here are some of those supply side arguments. One is social norms. So there's an understanding around what are good jobs for women. Should women work at all? There's a larger debate on should women actually be, is it a sign of low income if your woman is going out to work? So there's constraints around just challenging those norms. Yeah. Working age women is basically women 15 years and above. So official definition. So typically in our labor statistics, we don't have an upper limit because our labor market is also very informal. So people tend to work beyond 60, 70. But if you go to more high income countries, the upper limit tends to be about 65. Even that keeps changing now as populations age. But mostly in India, when we talk about working age, it's 15 and above. You'll see some places where they do restrict it to 15 to 65, but usually it's 15 and above. So the supply side, you have these norms kind of explanations for why employment is low. Then you have mobility restrictions, that you just don't have the infrastructure, and women have huge challenges, and this could come from just the lack of physical infrastructure to get to work, but it's also just you don't have safe public spaces, you have possibilities of domestic violence, not just at home but outside as well, when just getting to work. Then you have the burden of care argument, that there's a lot of expectations for women to shoulder the household work and child care. And the other one is low earnings, that how much earnings that women get is so low that it really doesn't give them enough incentive to actually join the workforce, and it doesn't make up for all of these other challenges that they have to face. So I'll go through some of these and draw upon what has been some evidence discussing some of these. The other explanation is demand side constraints. The demand side story is saying that as the economy has grown, what has happened in India is agriculture has shrunk, women have been pushed out of that space, but the kind of work which should occupy women have not come about, especially given that women's education rates have also gone up. So you don't have jobs or office-based jobs that women would want, you don't have jobs that are flexible, and because of that, because of the lack of demand, women have been sort of pushed out of the labor market. We don't have a lot of information on this demand side story simply because a lot of the data and statistics that we collect is basically stuff that we collect from households. We don't typically, at least as academics, a lot of our work doesn't look at what our employers saying, how our enterprise is hiring. It's very difficult to get at that. We are actually now doing some preliminary research around this work, but this is kind of limited evidence. And the third part of the story is inadequate measurement. Yeah.
So I just want to know, is it because of the gender pay gap or is it just low earnings across the board?
It's gender pay, so low earnings relative to men, and I'll show you some of those numbers there. Yeah. And the third explanation is that we're just not measuring women's work correctly, which is the explanation for the low rates of women's employment. So what I'll do today is basically take you through the first and the third explanation, largely because this is where we have done work, and park the demand side, but I'm happy to discuss your thoughts on this as well. Okay, so coming to the measuring question, what are we measuring? Right? I gave you this employment rate of 20% of women are working, but what does it mean? How are we getting this number? So what the labor survey does is that it typically goes to a sample of households, so it's not a census. It goes to a sample of households, and the sample is chosen in such a way that the numbers speak about India, so it's representative as we call it. And they usually ask whoever is present in the household. It need not be the head of the household, it could be a woman as well, and they ask them who all stay in this household and what is their major activity. Right? So what do they do for the majority of the time? And that is the sort of one overarching question that is asked to get at activity status and therefore employment status of both men and women in the household. So this is how labor surveys collect it, and because of this way of collecting it, you have multiple biases coming in to the data collection process itself. Okay? So there are different kinds of biases. One is there's a conceptual bias, and then there's an operational bias. And I'll talk about very briefly on what the conceptual bias is, but spend more time on the operational issues. So the conceptual bias is, what are you asking about? So when you ask somebody if they are employed, what do you mean by employed? So if you're at home and you are taking care of the child, are you sure that doesn't qualify as employed? But if you're at home, you're making some food, or you're making some pickles and jams, which maybe some of it you sell outside. Does that qualify as employment, right? So in the literature, there's been a lot of ambiguity on what characterizes, what actually employment qualifies as. Besides that, there's the more operational issues of how do you go about collecting data? How is the question being asked and who is it being asked to? Okay, so on the what is being asked, I don't know if anyone's familiar with this image. So this was actually the cover page for the Kerala 2021 budget, and this was a painting made by a 5th standard child who was drawing basically this all the things that he observed his mother doing during the course of the day. Now you can see that there's a lot of things that she's doing, but a lot of this technically does not qualify as employment, right? And what the labor statistics literature has really made quite a bit of ground in is to really make this distinction between work and employment, okay? So employment is any work for pay or profit. So if what you're doing ends up with you either getting a pay as a salary or a wage, or if what you're doing ends up with you being able to trade something and get some profit, that's employment. And that is sort of the boundary of employment. And so then you have this, you can have all women are working, but not all of them are necessarily employed. And there is still a lot of back and forth amongst feminists and others on, is this the right way to be capturing women's employment? So it's not been entirely resolved, but at least the boundaries are very clear now. Okay, so I'm not going to spend too much time on this, and rather I want to spend time on the how and the who. So for this, we don't have a lot of information, and I draw from actually some primary survey that we had done at the center. This was a 2-state survey. Now in retrospect, I keep laughing, and we did this in Karnataka and Rajasthan, and we called it India Working Survey, but it's really a Karnataka and Rajasthan Working Survey, which was a somewhat ill-fated survey which went on the ground in Feb 2020. March 13th, it had to be prematurely terminated because of COVID. It was also the CA NRC time, so we also had some problems with interviewing households. But in any case, we were able to speak to about 6,000 individuals as part of our survey. Now, one of the things that we wanted to do with this survey was specifically the who and how question. Doesn't matter who we are asking the question to, and doesn't matter how questions are being asked. Okay. So if you remember when I said in a standard labor market survey, what they do is, what is your major activity? That's the question that's asked. What we did slightly differently is that when we went to a household, we randomly picked out one adult male and one adult female. Okay. And to both of them in separate interviews, so they were sort of made to sit apart from each other, we asked actually these 4 questions. So it was not one overarching question. We asked, did you do business, farming or self-employment activity? Did you assist without pay? So did you do help with your family farm or business? Did you work for wage or salary? And did you, make goods which were sold in the market? Right, so we're really calling out different kinds and the 4 broad types of employment activities. So that's one thing we did. The second thing that we did was that, like I said, we spoke to one adult man and one adult female, right? If this pair somehow happened to be a spousal pair, if they were married to each other, we asked them to tell us what their spouse was doing. So I would ask the woman, did your husband do each of these things? Each of these 4 activities, we would ask her to tell us about her husband, and the husband, we would ask him to tell us about his wife. Right? So we're getting at the who and how in that way. Right. I'm going to go through this, which is basically the employment rate for men. So 76.1 is when men report about themselves. So we take all the information that men are giving us about men's employment. 76% say that is a 76% is the men's employment rate. This proxy is all the information that women give us about their husbands. So it's the male employment rate reported by women, more or less similar, about 1.4 difference and not statistically different. This is when women report about themselves, 59%, but when we spoke to their husbands, only 54% of the husbands reported their women as working. So that's the difference of about 6% of underreporting of women's employment, right? So the moment we spoke to men and asked them to tell us if their wives were engaged in any of those 4 activities, there were many husbands who didn't acknowledge that their wives were employed, even though the wives themselves reported as being employed. Okay, so that's one way in which it matters, the identity of the respondent. Who do labor statistics go and speak to? Who's reporting on behalf of other people? It can severely, change the kind of measures that you're getting. So the who matters. The other thing, and I just want you to focus on the red and the mustard bars. So what we did is, the 56% is the employment rate of women, and this was actually a different sample. It's a small experiment we did on the site. Is when we said, those 4 detailed questions. We asked women, did you do this? And we're asking women themselves. There's no proxy reporting here. We're just asking women to tell us about yourself. So 56%, when we asked women 4 kinds of questions instead of one overarching question, in that sample the employment rate that you get is 56%. Now in an identical sample, and I say it's identical because we've statistically tested that it's exactly similar characteristics of women, instead of asking detailed questions, we just asked that one question: what did you primarily do? Were you employed last week? Did you do any employment activity for at least an hour in the last week? There, when we do that, we get women's employment rate of only 44%. And mind you, this is women talking about themselves. Okay? So here is where the how also comes in, which is that even when women are reporting about themselves, if you don't call out activities, for a lot of women their primary identity is not one of being employed. And they'll say, oh no, I didn't do anything, I was just helping with the housework and helping with some of the chores, and so then as an enumerator, as a surveyor, you just mark them as not in the labor force. Whereas when you call it out, women then say, oh yeah, no, I helped in the family farm, or oh I did this, oh I did this. They are able to recall. It's not just a recall thing, it's basically enabling them to see themselves beyond their primary identity of a homemaker. Right? So that's how the how matters. Okay? But this is to say that generally in employment statistics, what happens, and I think, so these are 3 different surveys in India. I'm not going to go into the technicalities. The PLFS is our official employment survey. But what I want you to see is, when you take the CMI, which is one kind of employment survey, women's employment rate in Karnataka is around 5%. Okay? If you take PLFS, which is the government's official survey, women's employment rate is slightly above 20%. And if you take our survey, which has those detailed questions, women's employment rate shoots up to about 60%. Okay? So, and you don't see that huge variation when it comes to men's employment. So the point I'm trying to make is women's employment is very difficult to measure and hugely susceptible to how and who and the what of asking questions. Okay? And these are just some of the ways in which these differences play out, but there's many other ways. But as a number, as a statistic, it's something that's notoriously difficult to capture, especially in low income countries where there are a lot of norms at play, but also employment is not your standard formal type of employment. There's also a lot of informal employment, intermittent work that happens for just a few hours, So all of that comes up with this huge variation, okay? But I do want to caveat all of this to say that what this explains is the low levels, but it doesn't really explain the declining trends in women's employment, because the method in which data has been collected has not really changed. But the low levels can be explained to some extent by just the fact that we're not asking the right questions and to the right people. So that's the measurement challenge. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is actually by an anthropologist, and it really sums up this research around that we were looking at, that a great deal of information comes from questions asked of men about their wives, daughters and sisters. And what women do is perceived as household work, and what they talk about is called gossip, while men's work is viewed as the economic base of society, and their information is seen as important social communication. So this kind of puts together essentially what we find with some of this measurement question. Now, moving beyond the measurement question, I want to get into the supply story, and I'm going to dwell on a few of these, okay? Not spend too much time on each, but just take you through some of them. So, what I have here is husband's earnings. So, we wanted to see really how do household factors interplay with the likelihood of women being employed, okay? So, on this line here is husband's earnings, and this is the likelihood of a woman being employed, okay? I'm assuming that both of these concepts are familiar. So if, for example, in a household where the husband, in rural areas where husbands earn about 10,000 rupees, the likelihood of his wife being employed is around 40%, right? And as husband's earnings increase, so as you go to richer and richer households, the likelihood of the wife being employed declines steadily in rural areas, okay? But in urban areas, you see that it's really not a monotonic decline, right? So the first point is that women's employment rate isn't in the decision for women to be employed is often not something that she herself negotiates. It's something that is mediated within a household, keeping in mind multiple constraints and so on. And so there's this one very clear relationship that occurs. But in urban areas, what you have is, yes, you have the decline, but beyond a certain level of income. So for here specifically, as husband's earnings go above, if you go to a household where the husband is earning about 40,000 and more, then you have women spouses are also more likely to be employed compared to your sort of middle income households. Okay. So as husband's earnings increase, there's also a likelihood that in urban areas, women are actually starting to participate more and more. I don't know if you have some idea on what could be mechanisms that go behind at least this inverted U. I'm sorry, not the inverted U, a U in the case of urban areas. So one thing that happens here is that as you go to richer households, they are able to pay for childcare and pay for your cook and cleaning staff, which allows then the women in that household also to re-enter the labor market or the paid labor market. And that explains some of this upward shift. So the other thing that you can think of is that another possibility is possibly that if you're thinking of a husband who earns say 60 and 70,000, because of how marriage markets in India work, you can imagine that he is also likely to be married to a highly educated woman. Because he is also earning this much, he's also probably highly educated, and because of this kind of matching that our marriage market does, he's also likely to be married to a very highly educated woman who might have better bargaining power to enter the labor market, but also would be earning higher if she were to enter, right? So because her sort of the wages that she can receive if she works is quite high, then you will find that those kinds of women are also more likely to participate in the labor market. Okay? So in urban areas, you have this kind of curious trend of women in higher income households actually more likely to participate, but this is also very high, and I think I want to just point your attention to this, that employment rate for women in very poor households tends to be very high. And that is also signaling towards what employment means for women. And I'll dwell on some of this as I go on, that for a lot of women, employment is not a choice. It's something that you have to do to contribute to family incomes, right? And so this idea of employment as the end game is also something that we need to revisit, especially when you're thinking about a low-income country context as well. So in here, it may not be a purely voluntarily choice-led employment, whereas here it might be more of a choice-led employment. Okay? So that's one kind of way in which norms happen. I mean, we can get at norms through this. The other interesting thing that we found is the presence of a mother-in-law. What we found is that if you have your mother-in-law staying in the household and assuming that the mother-in-law is present but she's not employed, there's two ways that you could think that this could happen. If your mother-in-law is not employed, then there's possibility of childcare, and so then the woman can go out and work. Or if the mother-in-law is not employed, you can think that this may be a conservative household, or it may be a household where women don't need to work, they don't need to contribute to the family income, and so then the wife herself doesn't end up working. And what we are finding is the latter that holds. So if the mother-in-law is present and she's not employed, then you're finding that the woman herself is also not going to be employed, okay, more likely to not be employed. But the moment the woman is part of a household where her mother-in-law is also employed, then she is also likely to be employed. Possibly talking about the norms in the household, but also talking about just income and budget needs for that household. That women are working generally, and there's an expectation that women contribute to household budgets. Okay? So that's one way in which this kind of supply side norms come into play in determining women's employment choices. Now the other thing is, this is some work that draws, it's slightly dated because we don't have more recent information. So we looked at census 2011, and census actually collects information on how far do men and women in non-agricultural work, how far do they travel for work, okay? So one thing that was interesting is that, I mean, not entirely surprising, that in rural areas, majority of women who are working, so these are working women, about 55% of them are not traveling for work. They're working from home or within a radius of 1 kilometer of their house. The remaining travel, usually about, about a quarter of them traveling more than 1.5 kilometers. In contrast, you can see that in urban areas when women are employed, 35%, much smaller share, who don't travel. The majority are traveling, and a large chunk of them is traveling more than a kilometer and a half. Okay? And in general, actually the distance traveled is not very different for men and women. They are all both traveling around 11 kilometers to access work in urban areas. So it is a fairly large distance, but interestingly not hugely different for men and women. Sorry? Yeah, unfortunately we don't, I mean the latest census has just not been done for various reasons, so we don't have, so this is probably going to, I mean it's going to increase if, but this is the distance, not time spent on commute. So it could increase if you're thinking of cities expanding and employment opportunities being located outside cities, that's a possibility. But you could also think of if public infrastructure is developed between 11 and 23, then maybe you are able to have more local job opportunities as well. And I'll come to the second bit of it, which is that, and this, I don't know how much this is going to change with the more recent information. What is the mode of transport, right? So this is your women or men traveling 0 to 1 kilometers, and this is women traveling 0 to 1 kilometers. Majority are just doing this by foot. They're able to walk to work. As distance increase, let's just see just between these two bars. The moment you go to 2 to 5 kilometers, what happens for men is bicycle becomes the prominent mode of transport, followed by motorized vehicle. For women, there's still a large share who are still walking to work, and then some of them choosing motorized vehicle, very few choosing bicycles. But as distance increases, you can see what increases really is this big blue bars, which is public transport. Okay, so women rely heavily, very, very heavily on public transport, whereas men usually end up using either, largely motorized vehicles to get to work. Okay, and this is where, just to contextualize it with the more recent thing, is the importance of some of these gender-specific policies. So I'm sure you're all aware of the Shakti scheme, which is the free bus travel for women, right? So on the one hand, it was criticized as freebie and a waste of public resources. But what actually has happened, and we've now got enough evidence, we've got about 2 years of evidence to look at what has been the impact of this kind of free thing, is that it has increased women's employment rate. So compared to employment before and after Shakti scheme, there's been an increase in women's employment, and it also has had a lot of other spillover effects, which is that the moment income has been freed up, they don't need to spend on commute, they are able to spend that money on other things, which is your other consumption items. And for the government, what that has meant is that it's an increase in GST, right? So there's a sort of way in which this kind of policy, which was aimed at facilitating women's mobility, has had this not just an impact on employment, but it has had this fairly virtuous cycle. Okay, and I think it's also important to recognize this scheme because it can be thought of as purely from an employment creation perspective, but it's also nice to recognize it for the value it's brought into just acknowledging women's access to leisure, right, and their right to leisure. So a lot of the Shakti, a lot of the reporting on Shakti has also focused on how a lot of women are now using this for pilgrimages and just leisure and traveling to places of sightseeing and so on. Again, it has received a lot of flack. Oh no, it's wasteful. But I think it's to think of women's leisure as also an important outcome, but also the presence of women in public spaces, right? It also is important not just for the fact that it allows women to commute, but also the fact that you have more women in buses. They may not be going to work, but you just have more of women, which makes it a safer environment of sorts. So it's this kind of, I mean, so distance and mobility infrastructure has had huge implications. And this, I mean, there's a lot of evidence it doesn't just come into employment. So there's an interesting study in the Delhi context where this author is called Girija Borkar, who looked at a specific bus route which was going through slightly unsafe areas, and she found out that girls were actively choosing not to go to colleges that were near on that bus route because it was unsafe, and they changed their choice of college so as to avoid those bus routes. So even your choice of educational institution, your choice of subject is also constrained by access and mobility restrictions, and it's not just a pure employment based outcome. The other thing is this idea of motherhood penalty. So the supply side, another big explanation is that women have care burden, and because of that they tend to not be able to access the paid labor force. Now this is the idea of motherhood penalty is very, very common in the Western literature. The moment women have children, they withdraw from the labor market, and even if they come back, they end up earning far less than what men make. But there's very limited evidence on what this penalty means, or is there a penalty at all for low and middle income countries. Part of this is because we just don't have enough data. Because if you want to make this statement, you should be able to kind of track women over time, before childbirth, after childbirth, and then look at their employment and earnings. We just don't have that kind of data in India, in most developing countries, so we've not been able to say much. I'm not going to spend time on this, but what we did was, so with the India Working Survey, we actually collected retrospective data. So we were able to ask women from the time that they were 15 years old, what was your major activity, were you employed or not, and then we located their event of childbirth, and then so after childbirth, we continued to collect their employment activity. So it's sort of retrospectively collected information, we're not tracking them. Now, what we found was that in the Indian, and this is the rural labor market, because the IWS was largely a rural labor survey, was that we found that there's no change in women's employment after the child is born. You don't find a decline in rural women's employment rate after childbirth. So we were quite puzzled on what was going on, because it really countered a lot of the expectations that we had. What we found was that basically women continue to remain employed, but their employment is largely informal. So they are helping in the family farm, or they're going for very informal casual wage work. Okay, there's no increase in their salaried work. So that doesn't go up. It's your informal work that continues to increase and isn't affected by childbirth. Okay. Which is then we were kind of saying, okay, we realized that what was happening was for many households, it's not a choice. You don't have a choice to take off from work. You have to continue, and you'll see it's a very common sight in, at least in urban areas with construction spaces. You have women with their babies engaging in work, and so then there's the idea of penalty then doesn't exist, right? We don't have more evidence in the urban context, but I do want to just, so one thing that we had done was a bunch of qualitative surveys with about 50 to 60 women located in Bangalore and Delhi, just to understand some of these constraints and speaking to them on what challenges that they face. And this was an interview with a woman in Delhi, what she was telling us about her children. So actually her children were previously being taken care of by a sister-in-law in her village. And I think they were not being treated well, so she had to bring them to Delhi to stay with her. And this is what her day looks like. She gets up at 3 a.m., prepare food, clean the house, bathe and finish my prayers, prepare tiffin for the children, and then she hands them over to the neighbor. Then the children go to school, and then the neighbors are sort of the informal childcare. But you can see that the woman, her work continues, her employment continues, and for a lot of these women that we spoke to, the childcare was just something that they ended up having to do alongside employment. So it was not something that you can do one or the other. And this is now we are actually looking at, so in India we now have time use data to see when women are in wage work, does it reduce the time that they spend on childcare or on household work or other kinds of leisure. And we are finding that especially in urban areas, there's no trade-off. In rural areas, there's some kind of a trade-off that okay, if you are going out of the house to go to do wage work, you tend to have fewer time spent in childcare or household work. But in urban areas, when women are in wage work, we find that there's actually a double burden. So she's doing this and paid work. So it's the motherhood penalty is a very nuanced thing if you look at a country like India. So in rural low-income countries context, you're finding that there's no penalty, and that comes from the fact that for many households employment is a necessity. It's not a choice, and there's been some interesting work by folks at IIHS which has investigated some of this, where they find, for instance, that women, the children are getting fewer months of breast milk. Women are also not getting postnatal care. So you continue to remain employed, but at the cost of your health and your child's health, right? So then to say that there's no penalty is wrong. It's just that the penalty is not the one of withdrawing from work. The penalty is that you have to continue staying employed, and you have to take into account your sort of socially ascribed role as a caretaker. So you have to do both, right? And so the penalty still very much exists, but not in the traditional understanding of the motherhood penalty. But to kind of bring it all together, so you have the rural low-income context of this lack of penalty, but women having to continue working. But in the urban areas, on the one hand, you have this woman that I quoted from, where she's talking about a similar kind of double burden that she endeavors with. But then you also have our high income, creches and office kind of providing support, right? Now this also has got a lot of attention. So what has happened with the Maternity Benefit Act was that previously, I think it was 4 or 3 months, and then they recently amended it, maybe about 2 years back, they amended it to have more months of maternal leave for mothers. Now what has happened because of the amendment is that women's employment rate has actually declined. So basically for a company or a firm to hire a woman, she's very expensive because she can get pregnant and leave. And so that's also speaking about how do you think of policies around this, right? So the moment you have a potentially well-intentioned policy like a maternity benefit amendment, but because it's targeted, and in this case it's a gender-specific policy, it actually penalizes that gender, right? And that's where you need to think about policies that are not necessarily gender-specific. You should also be thinking about leaves where either parent can take it, but also thinking about how the public sector comes into play. So the moment an individual firm gets sort of penalized for hiring a woman, then they internalize the cost and the woman is becoming expensive. But if you can think of childcare facilities that extend beyond just the firm context, but you think of a more centralized kind of childcare facilities, that's where you're not getting an individual woman being penalized, but rather it's a contribution that companies are mandatorily expected to make, whether you have women employees or not, right? And then you don't then individualize women's costs as much as is being done now. So I think policy also needs to think of this slightly differently, especially given that we have very limited public infrastructure around childcare. Now, so I've talked about these sort of entry barriers, right? And now when women do enter, and this is the earnings gap that I wanted to talk about. So on an average, the per month salary for women is around 14,000, and men in salaried work earn about 18,000, okay? So in salaried employment, women make about 75% of what men make. In self-employment, women don't even make half of what men make. And if you're in casual wage work, it's slightly better, about 64%. But you can see that salaried work is where the gap closes, but there's still a gender wage gap. Okay. Now you can argue that some of this gap is possibly because women may not be your science graduates. They may be may not be in IT industries. Most of them are domestic help. So the gap is coming simply because women are doing different kinds of work. Women may be less educated, and that's why there's an earnings gap. What we did is so there are techniques to kind of let's compare like with like. So we'll control or factor out all of these individual differences and allow to just compare identical men with identical women. We find that the majority of this gap is not explained by differences in characteristics. It is purely some unexplained. Okay, so we call it an unexplained component. We are always advised in the academic literature that you cannot call it discrimination because you don't have the exact evidence for discrimination. It's things that you don't observe, but some of this is potentially discrimination. Yeah. And I think that, so it's very difficult to get at some of these discriminatory practices, but I think if any of you have attended interviews, you can talk. I can speak for myself that I've attended about 3 interviews, and I'm not talking about my current employer, so they are free of all of these accusations. But before this, when I did attend interviews, it was all in Bangalore. I was asked if I have children. I was asked if I plan to have more children. I was also asked if my husband's job is transferable. So all of these questions, and this is discrimination. This is clear biases that are operating, which operate only for women in a sense. But it's very difficult to get at some of this. There are ways. So there are these, something we in economics, we call it correspondence studies, where we send out CVs, identical CVs. The only thing that might change is maybe the gender or the caste. And they find that, just by changing the gender or the caste, the interview rate tends to be much lower for certain groups. Okay. One of these studies, which I find extremely insightful, is not for the employment, but for marriage. So there's a very interesting study by this lady called Viva Dhar, who basically set up these kind of fake profiles in bharatmatrimony.com. And identical profiles. The only thing that she varied between these profiles, there was one group of profiles where women expressed a desire to work after marriage, or she was already employed and wanted to continue working, and another set of profiles identical except for the fact that the woman didn't want to work. And what she finds is that if women do not want to work, those kinds of Bharat matrimony profiles are far more likely to get matches or sort of suitors interested in you. So even in the marriage market, so this is not even in the labor market, but even in the marriage market, there's a sort of penalty that comes with being employed for women as well. And so that, so that's one other way in which you can really measure discrimination at its core. This is a very rough estimate of discrimination, but it is pointing towards discriminatory practices. This is something that's close to my heart. This is work done by a professor of mine, Brinda Vishwanathan, and this is actually only for agricultural universities, but I do think this is broadly representative of all universities in India. I just want you to look at just this one graph, right? So this is the ordering of professorships in academia. So you start as an assistant professor, move on to associate, and then you're a professor. So that's the top end. And you can see, and we can look at the most recent data, that about 40% of assistant professors tend to be women. So it's not half, but about 40%. But as you move up the hierarchy, the number of women tend to fall out. And that's your sticky flow, glass ceiling, and your leaky pipeline. You're losing women as you move up the hierarchy. You have a bunch of women who are also stuck at the bottom, who are not able to get above the top. And the other interesting thing is that, one measure in academia of sort of, I don't know if it's quality, but it's your academic proficiency, is citations, which is that how many papers do you have and how many people refer to your papers. And you will see that if once a woman is a professor, she has far more citations than an equivalent male professor, which again points towards, as a female, to get to a professorial position, you have to be extremely high achieving, right? And there's multiple things coming in play here. So there's a very interesting study by Forbes which talks about when men see a potential role, a job. Now this could be a promotion, it could be a new job. Men will apply even if they tick 60% of the qualifications, whereas women will only apply if they tick 100% of the qualifications. So there's one kind of sort of basic confidence and just the oomph of applying, but just the self-confidence. But there's also just discrimination also happening at this level, and this is from academia. But we don't have too much information for specific sectors, but it largely does operate like this in most sectors as well. And keep in mind that education is a major employer for women. So this is a big experience for a large chunk of female salaried workforce. So that's the leaky pipeline. So yeah, just to kind of bring it all together, what you see is that women's employment rate has declined until recently. On the one hand, we also have this extremely high educational attainment. In fact, now there's this, the number of graduate women in the workforce is almost as many as number of graduate men. So we are a highly educated pool of women. And fertility rates have also gone down. So childcare is not really that much of a burden anymore, especially in cities. In urban India, fertility rate is below 2, which is 2.1 is your ideal fertility rate. It's now at 1.8, which is very low. So those kind of constraints that you're not educated enough, you have this kind of care, that is reduced. But despite that, women's entry into the labor force continues to be thwarted. And one reason is the continuing role of norms, but also the lack of sort of good jobs, but also suitable jobs. And suitable jobs is where the norms question also comes into play. So I'll stop now and thank you.